This chapter on behavioral ecology is a kind of a interesting one just because there's so much stuff to talk about. We can't really cover it all, and I'm going to kind of gloss over things, and you're welcome to look back in your textbook at some of the experiments and things that are done on behavioral ecology. Behavioral ecology is basically observations of animal behavior by studying how it's controlled and how it contributes. The bottom line is, how does their behavior contribute to survival, and then evolutionarily wise, natural selection wise, to reproductive success. Um, so the first terms you need to know, and there's a lot of terms in here, are the difference between proximate and ultimate causes of behavior. Okay? Proximate and ultimate causes. Proximate, you see the word approximate in there, so close to the immediate mechanism of the behavior, and then ultimate cause is how does it contribute to survival and reproduction. So the proximate cause is why do they do it right then, and the ultimate cause would be how it contributes to survival and reproduction. Learning is also considered behavioral. So once again, proximate questions focus on environmental stimuli or other mechanisms underlying a behavior. We'll look at this in a second with a couple examples. And ultimate questions on the evolutionary significance. So a couple of kinds, there are three kinds of behaviors that we're going to talk about here. One is called a fixed action pattern, or FAP. A fixed action pattern is a sequence of unlearned innate behaviors. Innate means you're born with them, genetic. It's unchangeable. Once initiated, it's usually carried to completion. An FAP is triggered by an external sensory stimulus known as a sign stimulus. Okay, and here's an example. In male stickleback fish, the stimulus for attack behavior is a red underside of an intruder. An experiment was done where they took a bunch of models and they swam them through the water above this fish, and the one that looks like a stickleback, they didn't do anything with. The ones that don't look like a stickleback but have a red underside, I mean, none of these really look like a fish, so these lures swam through the water, and the male would attack them. And so if we look at this experiment in some detail, so when presented with unrealistic models, as long as some red is present, the attack occurs. So the behavior is male stickleback fish attacks other male sticklebacks that invade its nesting territory. The proximate cause is the red belly. The ultimate cause is if you chase away another male, right, then by chasing away the other male, the eggs your eggs are going to fertilize, so it's your sperm that's fertilizing the egg and not his sperm that's fertilizing the egg. That increases your chances of reproductive success. Just remember, fish practice external fertilization. Another behavior is called imprinting. Imprinting is pretty interesting because, let me move this out of your way here a second. Includes learning and innate components and is generally irreversible. There's a sensitive period. A sensitive period is a limited developmental phase, the only time when certain behaviors can be learned. For example, young geese imprint on their mother. Okay, so during an early critical developmental stage, the proximate cause is the young geese observe their mother moving away from them and calling, so that means they know that that's their mother. You can do this yourself with birds. If you are around when baby ducks hatch and you walk away from them, and they'll actually imprint on you and you will become their mother, kind of like in that book, Are You My Mother? I don't know if you've ever read the book, but it's a little kid's book called Are You My Mother, where this baby bird hatches and can't find its mother. Well, in birds, they imprint on the first thing they see. So on average, the geese that follow an imprint on their mother receive more care and learn necessary skills and have a greater chance of surviving. That would be the ultimate cause. A guy named Lorenz, well, I'm not sure if this was Lorenz right now, but this guy, in order to help cranes, they're having problems with cranes, and he wanted to move them from one site to another, and they wouldn't leave their mother. So what happened is they had these baby cranes hatch and imprint on him and his hang glider, or whatever it is, powered hang glider. And now this picture is of him moving them to another area by having, they imprinted on him and his hang glider, and so now they think that's their mother. Directed movements. Directed movements are animal movements that have some genetic component. There are two kinds we're going to talk about. We're going to look at these in lab. And so a kinesis is when you turn in response to a stimulus. So you walk and you run into a wall, and so you turn. That's a kinesis. Okay? For example, bugs become more active in dry areas and less active in humid areas. So where it's moist, they stay still. When it's dry, they move around. Okay, so kinesis means this bug is just going to walk around and wander around until it gets to a moist area under a leaf. Taxis is a more or less automatic, oriented movement toward or away from a stimulus. So many stream fish automatically swim upstream. Okay, so this is a taxis. They feel the water on their face, for instance, and they face into it. So here's a fish facing a trout, facing into the river current. Food's going to float downstream here, and they won't be swept away by the current. Now, that doesn't mean they won't swim with the current if they have to get away from predators or whatever, but that's called a taxis. Okay, it's a directional movement. Migration is a learned behavior or somewhat genetic, and there's an incredible picture of birds that migrate. Animal signals. Animals communicate with each other. They can signal lots of different ways, and you can just think of a whole bunch of examples of animal signals. I'm not going to give you any. Communication then would be receive the signal, so a dog barks and another dog barks back. Okay, communication. Okay, we communicate all the time. We give signals all the time. Many animals use pheromones, chemical substances, to communicate. Okay, insects, fish, birds, and there's some evidence that humans use pheromones to communicate. We don't realize it. We call it subconscious. When a minnow or catfish is injured, well, I'll just show you the slide here. So here's a bunch of minnows widely dispersed in an aquarium. When one gets injured, they give off a chemical. Okay, and it's called an alarm substance. And when you put the alarm substance artificially in, they all congregate near the bottom and reduce their movement. There's safety in numbers is the theory. Okay, and so they school up when an alarm substance is introduced. That's communication. The alarm substance is the pheromone. Reaction is communication. Mating systems are pretty much genetic, and there's a bunch of research on this that we're not going to get into. I was just going to throw this up here. One thing we know for sure is that environmental conditions can modify behaviors. Okay, many behaviors are genetic, and we're going to get into this topic in class when we talk about human behaviors and choices. But environmental conditions can modify many behaviors also. There's an interesting study that was done on social environment and aggressive behavior. That two different species of mouse, there's an influence of social environment on aggressive and parental behaviors. So if we look at this, the comparisons are made with mice raised of parents by their own species, and we have California mice fostered by white-footed mice. So in other words, the California mouse is introduced into the litter of the white-footed mouse, and the California mice are pretty aggressive. The California mouse is less aggressive when it lives with white-footed mice, has less paternal behavior, in other words, takes care of its young less, and has less stress hormone in the brain. A white-footed mouse that lives with California mice isn't really any more aggressive towards an intruder, but is much more aggressive in a neutral situation. Okay? In other words, So there's some proof then that they're more aggressive than they normally would be in a neutral situation. California mice are less aggressive towards an intruder when they live with white-footed mouse, which is interesting that it's probably that, and there's a little discussion down here about where they got that data. Learning. Learned behaviors. Learning is actually just modification of behavior if you really get down to it. You change how you act based on specific experiences and you learn, right? So, and they can be simple and very complex. A couple of examples of learned behaviors: habituation. Okay, a simple form of learning that involves loss of responsiveness to stimuli that convey little or no information. Many of you are habituated to my voice. When you're in class and I start talking, after a little while, you don't respond to my voice anymore. Okay, that's habituation. Okay, if you keep touching a hydra, hydras, remember, are those little, really tiny organisms that live in the bottom of the ocean. They have tentacles. Okay, they stick themselves to a bottom, to a surface, and they catch prey. But if you touch them, they'll contract. If you quit touching them, if you keep touching them, they eventually stop. Okay, that's habituation. Spatial learning is when you change behavior based on what's around you. And there's a pretty cool experiment that was done. Sorry about this. Let me click back. Okay, when he surrounded this wasp nest with pine cones, and the wasps kept flying back to their nest. And he was wondering how they knew. So he surrounded it with pine cones, and then later on, he took the pine cones and moved them over here, away from the nest. And he found that the wasp used the environment to find its nest, which is a really cool, very simple experiment showing that wasps don't necessarily know where their nest is exactly in space. They use environmental cues to find it. Cognitive map is what's in your head, essentially. Associative learning. When animals learn to associate one feature of their environment with another. And there's two types of that. Classical conditioning, a type of associative learning when an arbitrary stimulus is associated with a reward or a punishment. Okay, so your dog smells the meat and starts to salivate. It's been conditioned, it knows the smell, so an arbitrary stimulus is associated with maybe getting something to eat. Okay, classical conditioning. Operant conditioning is when an animal learns to associate one of its behaviors with a reward or punishment, or trial and error learning. This little dog, this coyote here, with all the porcupine quills in its face, okay, has probably learned not to eat a porcupine. Okay, trial and error. So cognition then is, and problem solving are examples of this, the ability of your nervous system to think and do stuff and then solve problems. Monkeys can solve problems. There's some evidence. So the idea then is that genetics and the environment interact to influence learning. Next concept, that behavior can evolve by natural selection. So because genes influence behaviors, then behaviors can evolve in populations. When behavioral variation within a species corresponds to environmental variation, it may be evidence of past evolution. Okay, and there's a lot of discussion about this, and we're really talking about the idea of nature versus nurture. Okay, is it your genes that determine how you act, or your environment that determines how you act? So a couple examples of this, the energy cost benefit example. He looked at feeding behavior in crows. They eat whelks, which are basically like clams, but they drop them from the air to crack the shells. And so what he did is he had them drop it from different heights, and he watched them. So on the bottom is the height of the drop in meters. This is the average number of drops it took them to crack the whelk. from 3 meters, from 5 meters, 7 meters, 15 meters, but notice when you're that high, you have to spend a lot more energy flying up there. Okay? When you're 7 meters, you have to spend more energy flying up there. And what he did is he watched the crows as he figured out, he found the average that crows preferred. And it's interesting that crows prefer to fly 5.23 meters high and drop. That's how high they drop the whelk from. In other words, maybe a little bit of learning and maybe a little bit of genetics to understand that, okay, I can drop them from here and spend less energy. I can go higher and get them to drop faster, but it takes more energy. I can go really high and drop them. That takes a lot of energy. So the interesting thing is that the drop height they prefer is the one that's perfect for them. Briefly about sexual selection and mating behavior and mate choice. There are different kinds of relationships, and I really want to run these terms by you. There are promiscuous relationships in species. Promiscuous means that there's no strong pair bonds, no lasting relationships. They mate with whoever they want. There's monogamy. Humans try to practice this. One male mates with one female and lives with her for life. Monogamous species like these birds, many of them are what are called monomorphic. They look the same. You can't tell the difference between males and females because they're monogamous. Okay, once you find your female, no reason to, you'll see in a minute when we go. Polygyny is when one male mates with many females. In polygyny, the males are often more showy and larger than the females. So if you think of something like a duck, a male duck the male is really showy. Okay, so he would mate with many females. Okay, this elk, the male has the big antlers, the big neck, and the female elks look pretty much all the same. Polyandrous is when one female mates with many males. Okay, and poly is a prefix meaning many, remember? And so in this case, the females are usually showier than the males. Usually, not always. Okay, here's a female in this bird. The female is actually the colored one, and the male is smaller and less pretty. So mating systems and everything else kind of determines how the young are taken care of. And so in many species with external fertilization, parental care is as likely to be by males as by females. Okay? The very last thing in here is about altruism. Altruism is the concept that you are not selfish. Natural selection favors selfish behavior. Okay, we talked about this back in evolution, but I just wanted to cover it back again. Natural selection favors selfish behavior. Maximize my own survival and reproduction. So why then do organisms have altruism? And the theory is called inclusive fitness. That means that not only do I worry about my genes, but I worry about my close relatives' genes. And there's something called Hamilton's rule, which I wanted you to be familiar with, okay, where you could measure the chances that something would be altruistic using what's called the coefficient of relatedness. Okay, the probability that if two individuals share a parent or ancestor, a gene in one individual will also be present in the second. So there are three variables. Is the recipient of the altruistic act gonna be favored a lot? Is there a cost to the altruist? And how related are they? How many genes do they each have? So if you think about it, it's called kin selection. The natural selection that favors this kind of altruistic behavior by enhancing reproductive success. We will talk about this again with human behavior. Human behavior, and they talk about it in the book of Belding's Ground Squirrels, but we're going to talk about it a little bit in class when we talk about human behavior. So that brings us to the end of the things to talk about in this chapter. There's a lot here, and I think human behavior makes our discussion of human behavior in class will be much more interesting.